A billionaire-son CEO just had a grease-covered maintenance worker thrown out of her own boardroom in front of every senior executive in the company. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask why he was there. She just saw the dirty uniform and made her decision in 3 seconds flat. What she didn't know, what nobody in that room bothered to tell her, was that this quiet, exhausted single father had been the only reason her billion-dollar company was still standing. And he just quit. If you're new here, subscribe and hit that bell, because this story is only getting started. Drop your city and country in the comments right now, so I can see exactly how far this story travels. And if you believe people deserve credit for what they actually build, smash that like button before we go any further. The tunnel smelled like machine oil and old concrete. Caleb Rowan had spent so many hours down here that he could navigate it half asleep, which was useful, because most days he was running on somewhere between 4 and 5 hours. He moved through the underground maintenance corridor with a flashlight in one hand and a diagnostic tablet in his other, checking pressure readings on a hydraulic coupling that had been throwing irregular numbers since Tuesday. It was 6:47 in the morning. He'd been here since 5:15. Above him, just 3 floors up, Northstar Aeronautics was preparing for the most important meeting in the company's history, a presentation to the representatives of Callaway Defense Systems, the aerospace client whose $43 million contract would either secure Northstar's next 3 years or quietly begin its unraveling. There were catered breakfast trays. There were freshly printed presentation packets. There were 11 people in expensive suits who had spent the last 2 weeks rehearsing exactly what they were going to say. Caleb didn't know about any of that. He was watching a pressure gauge that was lying to him. The number on the readout said everything was fine. But the sound coming from the coupling joint, a sound so faint that most people wouldn't have registered it as anything other than ambient factory noise, was telling him something completely different. Crouched down and pressed 2 fingers against the pipe housing. Felt the vibration, counted the intervals. "That's wrong," he said quietly, to nobody. He pulled out his worn notebook, actual paper, digital, and wrote down the reading. The time keyed, and a question mark beside a material designation code he'd been tracking for the past 3 weeks. Then he stood up, rubbed the back of his neck, and started walking toward the eastern junction to check the next point on his morning route. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it. A text from the school Lily's bus was running 12 minutes late, which meant his neighbor, Mrs. Peralta, would have to wait a little longer at the stop. He fired back a quick thank you text and kept walking. Lily was 7. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, which Caleb found both wonderful and exhausting in roughly equal measure. She'd lost her mother, Jonna, to a brain aneurysm 4 years ago here one Tuesday evening, gone by Wednesday morning. Yef, warning, preparation, nothing. Caleb had been 28, employed but not well paid. Modest house he and Jonna had stretched themselves to afford, with a 3-year-old who didn't fully understand why mommy stopped coming home. He'd figured out how to keep going. Not gracefully, without cost, but he'd figured it out. The house was clean enough. The fridge was usually stocked. Lily's homework got done, her lunches got packed, her school plays got attended. Caleb had learned to survive on less sleep than any human being reasonably should, and he had discovered that keeping his hands busy fixing things, solving things, understanding things was the only version of therapy he could actually afford. He was good at his job, exceptionally good. He just had no idea how to make anyone notice. By 8:30, Caleb had completed his morning route and was rewriting his pressure readings into the official maintenance log in the break room when his radio crackled. "You down there?" It was Davies, one of the floor supervisors. His voice had that particular tightness that meant something was going wrong somewhere. "Break room. What's up? They need you upstairs. Engineering's having some kind of situation with the Callaway presentation. Something about the material specs on Line 4's main support housing." No. Caleb stopped writing. "What kind of situation?" "The kind where Hendricks is sweating through his shirt. Preston Shaw is on his 3rd phone call." "That kind. He closed the logbook. "I'll be up in 5. Took the service elevator, which was slower but meant he didn't have to walk through the main lobby in his current state. He'd been in a crawl space earlier that morning. His uniform had a long smear of hydraulic grease across the left arm, and there was a smudge of something dark on his jaw that he'd tried to wipe off with a paper towel and mostly failed. He didn't think about it. He was thinking about the material designation code. The elevator opened on the executive floor, which Caleb almost never visited, and he stepped out into a hallway that felt like it belonged to a completely different company. Carpet was thick. The walls had actual art on them. There were people moving with the particular urgency of individuals who were afraid their careers were about to take a serious hit. Davies materialized at his elbow almost immediately. "Thank God," Davies said under his breath. "Come on." In the main conference room. "What exactly is the problem?" Callaway reps arrived early, like 40 minutes early, and one of their technical guys started asking questions about the support housing specs on the Line 4 assembly. Shaw couldn't answer them. Hendricks couldn't answer them. Someone pulled the actual documentation, and apparently there's a discrepancy that nobody can explain. Caleb felt something tighten in his gut. What kind of discrepancy? Material grade. The specs say one thing. The installation records say something slightly different. Shaw's been trying to explain it away as a documentation error. "Is it a documentation error?" Davies looked at him. "That's why I called you." They reached the conference room doors. Through the narrow glass panels set into the doors, Caleb could see a long table with perhaps 15 people around it. Northstar executives on one side, Callaway representatives on the other. At the head of the table, standing near a projection screen, Preston Shaw with a laser pointer in his hand and the expression of a man trying very hard to look confident. And at the far end, in the chair closest to the window, sat a woman Caleb had never seen before. She was younger than he'd expected for someone at an executive meeting of this level. Dark blazer, dark hair pulled back, posture that communicated absolutely zero tolerance for wasted time. She wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at the people around the table, and her expression was precise and unreadable. "Who's that?" Caleb asked. "That," Davies said quietly, "is Audrey Langston. She took over as CEO 3 weeks ago." Caleb had heard the name. Everyone at Northstar had heard the name by now 30 years old, had grown up inside her family's industrial portfolio, had spent the last 4 years expanding it aggressively, and apparently quite successfully. She had a reputation for being extremely intelligent and not particularly warm. "Okay," Caleb said, "let's go." Davies pushed the door open. Conversation at the table paused when they entered. Completely Preston kept talking, gesturing at the screen, but there was a shift in attention, the way there's always is when a door opens unexpectedly. Several heads turned. Caleb walked toward the section of the table, nearest to where Hendricks, the head of engineering, was sitting. Hendricks caught his eye and nodded with visible relief. "Caleb's? Yes, come look at this," Hendricks said, leaning over a stack of documents. "We've got a material designations discrepancy between the original spec sheet and the installation log for the Line 4 primary housing. Shaw thinks it's a paperwork issue, but our Callaway colleagues have some questions about what it means structurally, and I want a second set of eyes." Caleb pulled the documents toward him. He looked at the spec sheet first, the installation log, then the spec sheet again. He reached into his shirt pocket and found the folded page from his notebook, the one with this morning's pressure readings. The room was still making noise around him. Preston was still talking. Someone from the Callaway side was asking a follow-up question. Caleb was doing math in his head. It took him about 90 seconds. "This isn't a paperwork error," he said. The table went a little quieter. Preston stopped mid-sentence. "The material grade discrepancy is real," Caleb continued, still looking at the documents. "The installed grade is lower tensile strength than the specification required. In normal operating conditions, it probably wouldn't matter. Line 4 runs higher vibration cycles than it was originally rated for. I've been logging that for about 3 weeks. At current cycles, combined with this material grade, you're looking at Microfracture initiation at the coupling joints within. He did the calculation. Roughly 8 to 12 months. Maybe less if the line gets pushed harder. The silence was complete now. One of the Callaway technical representatives, a heavy-set man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, leaned forward. You're saying there's a structural defect? I'm saying there's a material specification failure that creates a structural risk under the actual operating conditions of this line. Whether that constitutes a defect depends on how you define the original spec requirements. Callaway rep looked at his colleagues. That's a defect, Caleb said. That was when Audrey Langston spoke for the first time. Excuse me. Her voice was level, not loud, but the kind of voice that has no trouble being heard. Caleb looked up. She was looking at him, with an expression that he recognized. It was the expression of someone who has made a rapid assessment and arrived at a conclusion. He'd seen it on people his whole life, usually followed by being ignored. Who are you? She asked. Caleb Rowan, maintenance. Something shifted in her face, not dramatically, just a recalibration. Maintenance, she repeated. Yes, she looked at Davies, then at Hendricks, then back at Caleb, and this time her gaze moved very briefly, very deliberately across his uniform. The grease on his arm, the smudge on his jaw he'd failed to clean off, the worn condition of his work boots. This is a closed executive meeting, she said. With our clients present, I understand. Davies asked me too. Davies isn't authorized to invite maintenance staff into a client meeting. She looked at the two security staff positioned near the side wall. Could someone please show Mr. Rowan? He said. Mr. Rowan back downstairs. Hendricks made a noise. Miss Langston, he actually just identified something quite serious. Whatever Mr. Rowan identified, our engineering team can follow up on it through the appropriate channels. Her tone didn't change. It was purely administrative, the voice of someone who has made a decision and is simply communicating it. Thank you, she said to Caleb. It wasn't a thank you. One of the security men took a half step toward him. Caleb felt something move through him. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something older and more familiar, the sensation of being assessed and found irrelevant based on information that had nothing to do with his actual value. No, he knew this feeling. He'd been living alongside it for 11 years. He looked at Hendricks, who was staring at the table. At Preston Shaw, who had found something very interesting to study on his phone. At the Callaway technical rep, who was watching Caleb with an expression that was difficult to read. Caleb reached up, unclipped his employee badge from his shirt, and set it on the conference table. It made a small sound, barely anything. He looked at Audrey Langston directly. This company survives without me. He turned and walked out. The elevator ride back down was quiet. Caleb stood with his arms at his sides and watched the floor numbers decrease and tried to figure out what had just happened. The surface was obvious. He'd been dismissed. Again, by someone new who had made the same assessment that people made about him regularly, just with more authority and a crisper suit. But the badge, he hadn't planned that. He wasn't a dramatic person by nature. He didn't rehearse speeches. He didn't make gestures. He'd just done it. The elevator opened on the maintenance level. He walked back to the break room, sat down at the small table in the corner, and looked at his hands. Still had grease under his fingernails. He'd need to get that before picking up Lily. His phone buzzed. A text from Davies. What the heck just happened? Call me. He didn't call. He sat there for a few minutes, and then he picked up his notebook and wrote down the material designation code, the calculation he'd done in the conference room, to himself. If nobody fixes this, line 4 has maybe 8 months before coupling failures start. He wrote something else beneath it, which surprised him a little. I quit. He told Mrs. Peralta he'd been let go, didn't elaborate, and she gave him the look that older women give when they know there's more to a story, and they've decided not to push. She brought Lily home from the bus stop at 3:45, and Lily came through the door with her backpack hanging off one shoulder and paint on her fingers from what turned out to be a very ambitious art project involving a lot of orange. You're home early, Lily said. which was more observation than question. I am. Did something happen? Yet he looked at his 7-year-old daughter, who had her mother's directness along with her mother's eyes, and he said, I left my job today. Lily processed this for a moment. Because they were mean to you? He hadn't said that. He hadn't said anything like that. Kind of, he admitted. Lily dropped her backpack by the door, a habit he'd been failing to correct for 2 years, and walked to the kitchen. Are we going to be okay? Yeah, Caleb said. We're going to be okay. She opened the refrigerator and studied its contents with serious intent. Can we have spaghetti? Sure. With the garlic bread or without? Okay. She pulled out a container of leftover sauce. You should probably update your resume. He almost laughed. Thanks, Lil. Mrs. Castellano says that's the first thing you do when you lose a job. Update your resume and don't panic. Mrs. Castellano is your second-grade teacher. She knows things. Fair enough. He spent that first evening doing exactly what he told himself he'd do. He updated his resume, searched job listings, emailed 2 former contacts at other facilities. Yes, put Lily to bed at 8 after 3 chapters of the book they were working through together. Then he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and his notebook, and he thought carefully about what he knew about his own employment history. He knew that for 11 years, he had been doing the work of at least 2 roles simultaneously. He'd been a maintenance technician in title and paperwork. In practice, he had been something closer to a systems analyst, an emergency diagnostic engineer, and an informal technical consultant who got called whenever things broke in ways that nobody else could explain. He'd fixed problems that saved the company significant money. He'd identified failure points before they became failures. He developed workarounds and solutions that had been quietly incorporated into the company's standard procedures, usually after being passed through someone else's name. That last part was the part he'd never said out loud to anyone. Preston Shaw had a reputation for innovative thinking that Caleb had largely built for him. Caleb understood how it had happened. Preston was good at meetings, good at presentations, good at positioning himself near solutions when solutions emerged. He'd learned early that Caleb was unlikely to fight over credit, unlikely to make noise, unlikely to push back. Caleb had a daughter at home and a mortgage and no stomach for workplace politics. Preston had taken credit. Not all at once, gradually, small amounts, in ways that were easy to rationalize as miscommunication or administrative overlap. And then more. And then it had simply become the established pattern. Caleb had told himself it didn't matter. He'd told himself that what counted was the work itself. He wasn't entirely sure he believed that anymore. He closed his laptop at 11:30 and went to bed, and he lay in the dark staring at the ceiling for a while before sleep came. His phone rang at 6:14 the next morning. Northstar's main engineering line. He let it go to voicemail. 7:02, Hendricks called from his cell. Caleb let that go too. 7:45, Davies texted, "Line 4 is down. They can't figure out why. Please call me back." Caleb made coffee, packed Lily's lunch ham and cheese, apple slices, the little bag of goldfish crackers she'd somehow never gotten tired of, and drove her to school. On the way back, he stopped at a gas station and filled up the tank, and stood in the thin morning light, watching the numbers on the pump and not checking his phone. He drove home. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and his notebook, and he thought about the joints on line 4, and he thought about 800 people who worked at that facility. Yep. And he thought about Lily's face when she'd asked if they were going to be okay. He picked up his phone and looked at the missed calls. 11. He put the phone face down on the table. Then he opened his laptop and sent follow-up emails to both of the contacts he'd messaged the night before. By mid-afternoon, the calls had stopped coming from Northstar's official lines and started coming from individual cell phones. Hendricks, Davies, 2 technicians from the floor crew he'd worked alongside for years. A man named Rourke, who'd been on the electrical team for 9 years and sounded genuinely frightened. "Caleb, line 7 is acting up now. I don't know what's happening." We've had 3 engineers looking at it, and nobody can figure out what Shaw figured out last year, the bypass procedure for the secondary relay system. You know how that works. Please. He listens to the voicemail twice. He didn't call back. He drove to the public library because Lily had a book due back and he'd forgotten about it. And he sat in the library parking lot for a few minutes after dropping the book in the return slot. Watching a woman help a small boy pick out books through the window, and he thought about what it meant to walk away from something you'd spent 11 years building, even if it had never technically been yours. He thought about the badge on the table. He thought about Audrey Langston's face and the way her eyes had drawn across his uniform. No, and how quickly she'd made the call. Then he drove home and helped Lily with her math homework, which involved fractions she found unreasonable, and said so at length, and he cooked dinner, not spaghetti. It was a Tuesday, so it was the chicken soup Jana used to make, the one he'd learned to replicate imperfectly, but close enough. And he sat at the table with his daughter, and they talked about the Orange Art Project, and about a girl at school named Priya, who had declared herself Lily's best friend with great authority, and whether that made them actually best friends or not. I think she decides things, Lily said. Is that okay? Lily thought about it. She decided we were going to be friends, and now we're friends. So I think, yeah, that's a good way to look at it. She also decided we're going to do our science fair project on butterflies, which I didn't get to vote on. You like butterflies? They're okay. A pause. I like moths better, actually. Why moths? Because everyone ignores them, but they do all the same stuff. Caleb set down his spoon and looked at his daughter. Yeah, he said. That's a good reason. The knock came on his door the following morning at 9:20, while he was on his laptop reviewing a job posting at a manufacturing facility 2 counties over. He wasn't expecting anyone. He opened the door to find a woman he'd never seen before. 30s, mid-dark coat, a messenger bag over one shoulder, and an expression that suggested she'd driven a considerable distance and wasn't entirely sure what kind of reception she'd receive. Mr. Rowan, she said. Yeah, my name is Nora Whitfield. I worked as a project coordinator at Northstar. I'm not there anymore, and I need to talk to you. She paused. I have documents. I think you need to see them. Caleb studied her for a moment. She looked tired, and she looked determined, and she was carrying a bag that was clearly heavier than a bag should be. He stepped back and opened the door wider. Coffee? He said. She let out a long breath. Please. She spread the documents up across the kitchen table, and it took him a long time to go through them. She sat across from him, and she didn't rush him, just refilled her own coffee when it went cold and waited while he read. The first set was maintenance records from his own logs, his own handwriting, his own entries, his own handwriting in some cases, with subsequent documentation above them that attributed the diagnostic conclusions to Preston Shaw's engineering review. The second set was patent filings, 3 of them. Caleb read through the technical specifications and felt a strange dissociated sensation, like recognizing your own reflection in a mirror that's been placed somewhere unexpected. He knew these designs. He knew them completely. He had created them. Preston's name was on the filing documents. The third set was internal emails spanning 8 years. Emails in which Caleb's name appeared exactly once, as the author of a brief maintenance note that had been forwarded up the chain. Preston's name appeared 214 times, frequently in connection with solutions, breakthroughs, and process improvements that Caleb recognized as his own. He sat back in his chair. His coffee had gone completely cold. Was watching him with careful, quiet eyes. How did you get these? He asked. I've been a project coordinator for 6 years, she said. Process documentation. Root filings. I've been watching this pattern for a long time, and I've been trying to figure out what to do about it. She paused. When you put your badge on the table and walked out, I made a decision. Pulled everything I could before I gave my own notice yesterday. He looked at the documents, then back at her. This is a significant personal risk for you, he said. Why? She was quiet for a moment. Because I've been routing papers with other people's names on them for 6 years, and I kept telling myself it wasn't my business. She looked at the table. That started to feel like a kind of lie. He didn't say anything to that. Try at the documents. He looked back to estimate just roughly, just as a starting point, what 11 years of this particular pattern might amount to. The number he arrived at was uncomfortable. I need to think, he said. Nora said, take the time you need. But Caleb, she stopped, seeming to register that she'd used his first name when they'd only just met. He didn't react to it. The facility is in serious trouble. They've had 3 production failures in 36 hours. Callaway contract is at risk. 800 people. He said, Sen, I'm not trying to tell you what to do. She gathered her coat and her bag. At the door, she turned back. For what it's worth, she said, I've been watching you fix that place for 6 years. Yes, he'd intervened, and it was always your name in the maintenance logs and always someone else's name in the meeting reports. I just want you to know that at least one person saw it. The door closed behind her. Caleb sat at his kitchen table for a long time, looking at the documents spread across the surface. Neshin, and he thought about what it meant to have something acknowledged even quietly, even years late, even imperfectly. He thought about moths. He thought about Lily asking if they were going to be okay. He'd intervened. He thought about 800 people who didn't know his name and didn't know how close their jobs were to the edge, and who had nothing to do with the choices that had been made over his head for 11 years. Outside, the morning was getting on. He had things to do, emails to send, calls to return, a job search to continue, a life to keep running on the money he had saved, and the time he had before that money started to matter. He pulled his notebook toward him. He opened it to a clean page, and he began to write down everything he knew about Northstar's failing systems in detail, in order, precise technical language that he'd spent 11 years developing, because whatever happened next, he was going to be ready for it. He'd learned he was not going to walk in blind. He was not going to walk in as the maintenance man they thought they knew. He didn't know yet exactly what he was going to be. But he knew the work, and the work, whatever else was true, still mattered. The notebook pages filled up faster than Caleb expected. He'd started writing at 9:47 in the morning after Nora Whitfield's car had disappeared down the street. By noon, he had covered 14 pages in the tight, precise handwriting that was his natural style, not neat, exactly, consistent, the kind of handwriting that meant the person doing it was thinking faster than their hand could move. He wrote down every failing system he could identify from memory, every pressure irregularity he'd logged in the past 6 months, every workaround he'd installed that the official maintenance documentation didn't fully explain, because the full explanation would have required acknowledging that the underlying design had a problem. Nobody wanted to officially acknowledge. He wrote down the line 4 coupling situation in detail, the material grade discrepancy, the vibration cycle data. Yes, the estimated timeline to failure he'd calculated in his head during the 90 seconds he'd stood in that conference room before Audrey Langston had decided he didn't belong there. He wrote down line 7 secondary relay bypass, the procedure he'd developed 18 months ago, the one Rourke had left a voicemail about, one that somehow lived in the company's institutional memory as something Preston Shaw had figured out. He wrote down 6 other systems that were currently stable but operating closer to their margins than anyone in the executive suite appeared to know. He wrote down the maintenance intervals that were being skipped to hit production targets. He wrote down 3 components that he'd flagged in writing through official channels as needing replacement within the next fiscal quarter, flags that had gone unanswered. Then he set the notebook aside and sat for a while and tried to figure out what he was actually going to do. Because writing everything down was one thing. What happened next was the question that didn't have a clean answer. He needed income. That was simply a fact. He had savings enough for 4 months at their current pace, maybe 5 if he was careful, and Lily didn't need anything unexpected, which 7-year-olds regularly did. He had a mortgage payment coming in 23 days. He had a job search that had so far produced 2 polite acknowledgement emails and 0 interviews. He also had 14 pages of technical documentation about a facility that was currently failing, 800 people whose employment depended on that facility, and a folder full of Nora Whitfield's documents spread across his kitchen table. Picked up his phone, looked at the missed calls from Northstar, looked at Rourke's voicemail notification, looked at a new text from Davies that said simply, Line 7 went down at 11. Engineers can't figure it out. I don't know what to do. Put the phone face down again. He thought about Lily. He thought about her matter-of-fact comment about moths, how they did all the same things as butterflies, but not flies, but nobody cared. He thought about the fact that she'd arrived at that observation on her own, at 7, without anyone explaining to her what it meant or why it was worth noticing. She was smarter than he gave her credit for. He was smarter than Northstar had ever given him credit for. Those two facts sat alongside each other in his mind for a while. Then he made himself lunch, a sandwich, standing at the counter, because sitting down to eat alone in the middle of the day still felt strange after 11 years of eating in break rooms. And he thought about Nora Whitfield's documents. And he thought about Preston Shaw's name on 3 patent filings. And he thought about a very specific number. $14 to $18 million. That was his rough estimate. Rough, because he didn't have access to the revenue figures, but he knew the systems well enough to understand what they'd been worth to the company. Process improvements that had reduced waste on 2 production lines. A diagnostic procedure that had prevented what would have been a catastrophic shutdown 4 years ago. The relay bypass. 3 other innovations that were now standard operating procedure at Northstar and probably generating value every single day. His name wasn't on any of it. He finished his sandwich, rinsed the plate, stood at the kitchen sink, looking out the back window at the small yard, where Lily liked to draw with sidewalk chalk, the concrete still faintly stained with the ghost of an enormous purple butterfly she'd drawn in June. Picked up his phone, not to call Northstar. He called his sister. Renata Rowan lived 40 minutes away, taught high school history, and had strong opinions about most things, which she delivered without much filtering. She'd been Caleb's person since they were kids, the one who knew everything, who never required an explanation of context, who could be counted on for a direct answer, even when the direct answer was hard. She picked up on the second ring. I heard you quit, she said immediately. Word travels, Mrs. Peralta told Mom. Mom called me. How it goes? A brief pause. Are you okay? No yet. Okay. Tell me, he told her. Not everything, he condensed it. The way you do with someone you trust completely and don't need to perform for. The meeting, Audrey Langston, the badge on the table, his visit, the documents. Renata was quiet for a moment after he finished, which was unusual for her. 14 to 18 million, she said, rough estimate. I know. That's not a paperwork error. That's not someone taking credit for a good idea at a meeting. That's a sustained, deliberate pattern. I know, Renata. Do you? Because you spent 11 years deciding it didn't matter. And I need to know if you understand now that it did. He was quiet. I understood it at the time, he said finally. I just didn't think I had the bandwidth to fight it, and also keep everything else running. Which is exactly what they were counting on. He didn't answer that, because she was right. What are you going to do? She asked. I don't know yet. That's why I called you. Do you want my opinion, or do you want me to listen? Listening first. So she listened. He talked through it, the job search, the savings, the 800 jobs, the systems that were failing without him, the strange, complicated guilt of knowing that walking away was the right response to what had been done to him, and also potentially damaging to people who had nothing to do with it. When he finished, Renata said, You didn't create this situation. The people at risk, that's not because you left. That's because they built an entire facility around one person's knowledge and then treated that person like furniture. I know that too, but you're going to go back anyway. It wasn't a question. Caleb looked out the back window at the ghost butterfly on the concrete. The way they think I will. What does that mean? It means if I go back, it's not because Audrey Langston needs a maintenance technician. It means I walk in there as someone who knows exactly what those documents are worth and exactly what I'm owed. Pause. Then Renata said, okay, now I have a question. Go ahead. The woman who threw you out. The billionaire. Do you actually believe she knew what Shaw was doing? He thought about it honestly. About Audrey Langston's face in the conference room. The quick assessment, the decision. She'd looked at him like he was a problem to be efficiently resolved. She hadn't looked like someone running a cover-up. She'd looked like someone who'd walked into a company 3 weeks ago and was operating on incomplete information and making fast calls. He said, I think she had no idea, so she's not the enemy. She treated me like I didn't belong in the building. And that's its own problem. But it's a different problem than what Shaw did. He sat with that for a moment. You're telling me to keep them separate. I'm saying they're different wrongs that require different responses. Shaw stole from you for 11 years. That deserves a reckoning. Langston embarrassed you once because she's never learned to look at people properly. A pause. One of those is a crime. The other is ignorance. Ignorance that cost me my job. Ignorance that you walked away from. Which might be the first time in 11 years you've actually put yourself first. She let that sit for a second. I'm not telling you what to decide. I'm telling you to make sure you're deciding it for the right reasons. He said goodbye, and he sat with the silence of the house for a while. At 2:50, he drove to school and picked up Lily, who came out of the building with paint on her hands again, different colors this time. Blues and greens, and launched immediately into a complicated story about a disagreement over the science fair project that had apparently been resolved through negotiation. We're doing moths and butterflies, Lily announced, climbing into the back seat. Comparative study. That was Priya's idea, it was my idea. Priya agreed, which she said was her decision. Caleb pulled out of the school lot. Sounds like it worked out. She's good at deciding things. I'm good at ideas. It's a good team. A pause. Dad, are you figuring out what to do? He looked in the rearview mirror at his daughter's face, serious and attentive in the way she got when she was treating something like it mattered. I'm working on it, he said. Mrs. Castellano also says that when something's hard, you should write down the good reasons and the bad reasons and count them. That's a pro and con list. Yeah, she called it that too, a beat. Did you do one? Sort of. What did it say? He thought about the notebook pages, the failing systems, the documents on the kitchen table, Rourke's voicemail, Renata's voice saying one of those is a crime. It said it's complicated, he told Lily. She accepted this with a small nod, the way she accepted information she planned to think about later. He standered. Then she went back to looking out the window, and they drove home through the late afternoon light. And Caleb made dinner, and helped with homework, and did the dishes, and put Lily to bed, and sat at the kitchen table afterward in the quiet that always settled over the house after she was asleep. The particular silence that held two people, and the memory of a third. Phone was on the table. He hadn't looked at since the afternoon. He picked it up. 22 missed calls from various Northstar numbers. 6 texts from Davies, increasingly terse. 1 voicemail from a number he didn't recognize, a 617 area code, Boston, which meant nothing to him. Played the voicemail. The voice was measured and deliberate. A man in his 60s, Caleb guessed, with the careful diction of someone who chose words with intention. Mr. Rowan, this is Gerald Hatch. I serve as chairman of the board of directors at Northstar Aeronautics. I apologize for the unusual method of contact. I obtained your number through our HR department. I understand you left the company 2 days ago, following an incident in our executive conference room. I would very much like to speak with you, directly, at your convenience, about the possibility of your returning to assist the company through the current operational difficulties. I want to be clear that I'm calling you, not our CEO. I'm calling because I've been reviewing maintenance records for the past 48 hours, and I have some questions that I believe only you can answer. Please call me at your convenience. Caleb listened to it twice. He sat with it. Gerald Hatch. He knew the name board chairman, had been connected to Northstar's parent Met Group for 15 years. Money. the type to make personal phone calls, unless the situation was severe. He looked at the time, 10:48 p.m. He put the phone down and went to bed. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it came, he wasn't restful. Called Hatch back at 8:15 the next morning after getting Lily on the bus. The board chairman answered on the second ring, which told Caleb something. "Mr. Rowan, thank you for returning my call. Mr. Hatch, I'll be direct with you because I think that's what this situation requires." A brief pause, the kind that meant the next sentence had been thought through. 48 hours since you left, we have experienced failures on 2 primary production lines, a near incident on our Eastern Assembly Corridor, a formal notice from Callaway Defense Systems that they're suspending contract negotiations pending a full technical review. I have been in continuous contact with our engineering team. They cannot adequately explain what is happening or how to fix it. Caleb said nothing. I have also spent the past 2 days reviewing 11 years of maintenance records, Hatch continued. Specifically, the records associated with your employee number. And I want to tell you, Mr. Rosen, what I found was significant. Still, Caleb waited. I owe you an honest statement, Hatch said. I believe this company has failed you in ways that go considerably beyond what happened in that conference room. I don't have the full picture yet, but I have enough of it to understand that you walking out of that building was not a small event. And I'm asking you, not ordering you as an employer, because you're no longer our employee. I'm asking you, one person to another, to consider coming back. Caleb looked at his kitchen table. Nora's documents were still there, organized into 3 stacks the way he'd left them after staying up until 1 in the morning to go through everything again. On what terms? Caleb said. A pause from Hatch's end. Uncomfortable, more like the pause of a man who'd expected this question and respected it. That would be a conversation I'd like to have in person, Hatch said. If you're willing, I'm willing to listen, Caleb said. But I want you to understand something clearly before we meet. Go ahead. I'm not coming back to fix the machines and disappear again. Whatever conversation we have, it has to start with the full truth about what's been happening in that building. Just the last 2 days, the last 11 years. A long silence. Caleb could hear faint background noise on Hatch's end and office, other voices at a distance. I think that's a reasonable place to start, Hatch said quietly. I'll have my assistant reach out to schedule a time. At the facility, Caleb said. Wherever you prefer. There's a diner on Morrison called Hazel's. The corner booth in the back is usually open on weekday mornings. I'll find it. They met on Thursday. Hatch arrived 6 minutes early and was already in the corner booth when Caleb got there, which also told him something. The board chairman was a compact man in his early 60s with silver hair and a plain watch, the kind of person whose wealth didn't announce itself. He had a cup of black coffee in front of him and no briefcase, no papers, no phone on the table. Caleb sat down across from him. The waitress came. Caleb ordered coffee and the eggs he usually didn't let himself order because of the cost, and then immediately felt slightly self-conscious about the cost consideration, and then let it go. Hatch waited until she'd moved away. Then he said, I've been on this board for 15 years. I want you to know that what you're about to tell me, I don't think I fully understood it was happening. Okay, Caleb said. That's not an excuse. A board member who doesn't know what's happening in his own company is either incompetent or not paying attention. I'll let you decide which applies. Neither one helps the people who got hurt, Caleb said. It doesn't. Hatch looked at his coffee. Tell me what you know. So Caleb told him. He brought the notebook and he laid it on the table and he talked for 40 minutes, and Hatch listened without interrupting, which was the right thing to do. And when Caleb was finished, Hatch sat quietly for a moment. Preston Shaw situation, Hatch said. The patents. 3 that I can document directly. Probably more that would require a deeper audit. And your estimate of the financial value. 14 to 18 million in generated value, based on what I know about how those innovations were implemented. I don't have the revenue numbers to be precise, Hatch looked at the table. Coffee had gone cold, and he didn't reach for it. That's not an administrative error, he said. That's fraud. That's what I've been told by someone whose opinion I trust. He hadn't actually spoken to a lawyer yet. He'd been turning that over. I haven't taken any formal steps. You have documentation. Enough to start with. Hatch nodded slowly. All right, here's what I can offer you. And I want to be honest that these aren't things I can guarantee. Unilaterally, they require board action. And ultimately, Ms. Langston's agreement. But I can tell you what I'm prepared to advocate for. He straightened. Independent technical authority, returning as a consultant rather than an employee, full naming rights on all solutions you implement. An immediate internal investigation into the Shaw patent situation, conducted by an outside firm. And I think you deserve to be in a room with Audrey Langston's and say whatever you need to say. Caleb looked at him steadily. That last one isn't a condition. That's something I'll decide when I decide. Fair enough. I have my own conditions, Caleb said, beyond what you've offered. Go ahead, Luis Mendoza. He's been on the floor crew for 16 years. He applied for team lead 3 times and was passed over each time, officially for reasons that had nothing to do with his performance. He paused. I want that reviewed and I want it fixed. Hatch wrote something in a small notepad he'd produced from his jacket pocket. Who else? There are others. I'll give you a list. Floor workers and technicians who have been doing skilled work without documentation or compensation that reflects what they're actually doing. He looked at Hatch directly. This doesn't work if I'm the only person who gets made right. The board chairman looked up from his notepad. For a moment, he just studied Caleb, the worn jacket, the careful eyes, the notebook on the table with its tight handwriting running across 14 pages. Said, I've been in business a long time. I've met a lot of people who said things like that. I'm sure you have. Most of them meant it about halfway. Caleb didn't answer that. I think you mean it completely, Hatch said. The floor workers are the reason that facility has stayed operational for 11 years. Me specifically. All of us. If the outcome of this is that I get a better title and everything else stays exactly as it was, then the problem isn't fixed. It's just redistributed. Hatch studied him for another moment. Then he wrote something else in his notepad. All right, he said. I'm going to go back to the board. This may take a day or two. Can I ask you to hold off on any formal legal action in the meantime? Caleb thought about the documents on his kitchen table. I'll give you 72 hours. That's fair. They sat there for another few minutes over cold coffee, 2 people who had been in entirely different worlds 3 days ago, and were now occupying the same corner booth in a diner on Morrison Street, trying to figure out how to handle a situation that neither of them had anticipated, and both of them were now responsible for, in different ways and to different degrees. One more thing, Caleb said before he stood up. Hatch waited. The Callaway contract. The line 4 defect I identified in the conference room, I can fix it. The structural risk is real, but it's correctable. The timeline is tight, but manageable. He paused. 800 people work at that facility. I don't want them to lose their jobs because of a fight between me and the executive suite. Was quiet for a moment. That's a generous position, given what they've done to you. It's not generous, Caleb said. Those are just the facts of the situation. Generosity doesn't have much to do with it. He left a 20 on the table for the eggs and the coffee, and he walked out of Hazel's into a gray morning with a thin wind coming off the direction of the highway. He sat in his truck in the parking lot and tried to figure out what he was actually feeling. Triumphant. That wasn't quite it. Not angry anymore, or not only angry. The anger was still there, but it had changed shape over the past 4 days, less like a fire, and more like something structural, load-bearing, a thing you could use if you handled it correctly. He thought about Lily, asking if they were going to be okay. Thought about the ghost butterfly in chalk on the back concrete. He started the truck. He needed to go home and update his notes and call his sister and figure out what to do with the next 72 hours. And also he needed to stop at the grocery store because they were out of the goldfish crackers. And that was the kind of thing that didn't wait for anyone's board meeting. Yomo! Pulled out of the parking lot. In his pocket, his phone buzzed once. He didn't check it until he'd parked at the grocery store. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize, which resolved when he read the message into something unexpected. "This is Audrey Langston. Mr. Hatch told me he was meeting with you this morning. I'm not asking you to return. I'm asking if you'll hear me out, not as your former employer. Just as someone who needs to say something to you directly. You don't have to agree, AL." He sat in the grocery store parking lot and read the message twice. Then he put his phone back in his pocket, went inside, bought the goldfish crackers and milk and a rotisserie chicken that was on sale, and thought about Renata's voice saying one of those is a crime, and the other is ignorance. He thought about the difference between those two things. Yes, he'd intervened. He thought about what it meant to demand a reckoning versus what it meant to demand an understanding. When he got back to the truck, he took out his phone again. He typed, "I'll hear you out. You pick where." He sent it before he could change his mind. He drove home. The gray morning was starting to break open at the edges, the kind of reluctant light that comes after a stretch of cold days, more suggestion than warmth. Caleb drove through it with both hands on the wheel, and his thoughts moving at a speed that was hard to follow, running through system specs and some patent filings and Luis Mendoza's name and the sound of Lily asking about moths. Underneath all of it, underneath everything, one simple fact that had been true for 11 years and was still true now. He knew what was broken. He knew how to fix it. The question was only what it was going to cost this time and who was going to pay. Audrey Langston picked a coffee shop, not the Northstar building. Her office, not anywhere that had a conference table or a receptionist or anything that would establish which one of them had the authority in the room. That told Caleb something too, the same way Hatch arriving early at Hazel's had told something. People revealed themselves in small logistical decisions, and the choice of neutral ground, a place where she would be simply a 30-year-old woman in a chair, a CEO behind a desk, suggested that she understood, at least partially, what she had done. Coffee shop was called Mercer & Co., and it was the kind of place that took itself seriously without being obnoxious about it. Dark wood, good light, the smell of properly roasted coffee. When Caleb walked in at 10:00 a.m. on Friday morning, having dropped Lily at school and driven 20 minutes across town, Audrey was already there. She was sitting at a small table near the window, both hands around a ceramic mug, and she was not on her phone. Was the first thing he noticed. No laptop, no documents, no assistant hovering nearby. Just sitting there. And when she saw him come through the door, she didn't immediately rearrange her face into a professional expression. She just looked at him, and he could see something in that look that hadn't been in the conference room, something more honest and considerably less comfortable. He walked over, sat down across from her. A server appeared, and he ordered a regular coffee black, and then they were alone with the ambient noise of the shop around them. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You said you had something to say." She nodded. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping well, which made two of them. Were faint shadows under her eyes, her posture, while still composed, had a different quality than the controlled precision he'd seen in the boardroom, less like armor. More like someone who'd taken the armor off and wasn't entirely sure what to do with their hands. "I've been running companies since I was 24, she said. Different sectors, different scales, but the same basic function. I walk into a situation. I assess it quickly. I make decisions. Speed and accuracy are what I'm known for." A pause. "In the room on Monday morning, I looked at you, and I made a decision in about 3 seconds. And I was wrong." Caleb waited. "I'm not going to explain why I made the assessment I made, because the explanation sounds like an excuse, and you've probably heard enough excuses from that building to last a long time." She looked at him directly. "I saw your uniform. I saw the state of it. I didn't ask who you were or why you were there, or why 3 of my senior engineers were looking at you the way they were. I just decided you were a problem, and I handled you the way I handle problems." She stopped. "That was wrong. Not just strategically. As a human being, it was wrong, and I'm sorry." The server brought his coffee. He wrapped both hands around the mug the same way she was holding hers, and he sat with what she'd said for a moment. "Did Hatch tell you what's in Nora Whitfield's documents?" he asked. Something shifted in her expression. "He gave me a summary." She exhaled slowly. "And I've spent the last 2 days trying to understand how I walked into that company 3 weeks ago and didn't see it." She turned the mug slightly in her hands. "The honest answer is that I was reading everything Shaw put in front of me. He was the senior engineer. He had the longest paper trail of innovations and solutions. I was building my understanding of the company's technical capacity around his profile." A pause. "He was constructing that profile for me. He'd been constructing it for 11 years, Caleb said. "I know that now. Before I came to the meeting on Monday, what did you know about me?" She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't. That's the point. Your name appeared in maintenance logs. There was no executive profile, no formal credit attached to your employee file beyond your job classification and your performance reviews, which were consistently good, but..." She stopped herself. The reviews were written by a supervisor who was 2 levels below Shaw. Shaw reviewed the supervisor. The information never moved upward in a way that would have been visible to me in 3 weeks. In 11 years, yes. She didn't look away. Or in 11 years, Caleb drank his coffee. It was good coffee, better than what he made at home, and he noted this in the abstract way that his mind catalogued small practical details even when larger things were happening around him. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead." That meeting had gone differently if I'd been in a suit instead of a maintenance uniform. If someone had introduced me properly before I started talking. "Would you have listened to what I said about the line 4 defect and treated me like I belonged in the room?" She looked at him steadily. "Yes, so it was never about what I knew. It was about how I looked." Yes, she didn't qualify it or soften it. "That's exactly what it was." He nodded slowly. "I appreciate you saying that clearly." "It doesn't fix it," he agreed. "It doesn't. It's a more useful starting point than a list of extenuating circumstances." For the first time since he'd sat down, something moved across her face that was close to a wry expression. Not quite a smile, not quite humor, more like the recognition of an unexpected directness. "Hatch said you were straightforward," she said. "Hatch doesn't know me. He read my maintenance logs for 2 days. He also said you made conditions." "I did. He told me what they were." She set her mug down. "I'm going to accept all of them. I want you to know that before we go any further. The independent technical authority, the naming rights, the Shaw investigation, the floor worker recognition, all of it. I'm not negotiating those." Caleb looked at her. "What about Luis Mendoza?" "Team lead position. Effective when you return. I reviewed his file last night. He should have had that title 4 years ago, at minimum. And the others on the list I gave Hatch. Being reviewed. There are 11 names. I expect most of them will result in reclassifications." She paused. "Can I ask you something now?" "Go ahead." "Hatch said you told him that you didn't want the floor workers lose their jobs because of a fight between you and the executive suite." She looked at him carefully. "Did you mean that?" "I said it. I know you said it. I'm asking if you meant it." He looked out the window for a moment. A woman was walking past with a small dog that had decided it was done walking and sat down firmly on the sidewalk. The woman stood there, leash in hand, waiting it out. "Those workers aren't part of what happened to me," he said. "They showed up every day. They did their jobs. Some of them have been doing their jobs longer than I have." He looked back at Audrey. "If Northstar collapses because I didn't come back, that falls on me too, even if the original fault belongs somewhere else. I don't want that. That's a very complicated moral position for someone who was thrown out of a building 4 days ago." "People have been telling me my positions are complicated my whole life," Caleb said. "Usually right before they take advantage of them." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to do that." "I don't know that yet," he said. "That's something you show over time. Not in a coffee shop." Pause. Then, fair enough. They sat in silence for a moment. Not an uncomfortable silence, just two people recalibrating around each other. Outside, the woman with the small dog had apparently won the standoff. Because the dog was walking again, with the indignant dignity of an animal that has decided to cooperate on its own terms. When can you start? Audrey asked. Monday, Caleb said. I need the weekend. The facility is in bad shape. It'll hold until Monday. Line 7's relay issue is serious, but it's not immediately catastrophic. There's a workaround that will sublight it for 7002 hours if your engineering team stops trying to fix the wrong component. He paused. Tell them to leave the secondary relay alone and redirect pressure through the tertiary bypass at junction 11. That should buy the time. She was already picking up her phone. Tell them exactly what I said, Caleb said. Not a paraphrase. Exact words. Junction 11, she repeated, typing. Tertiary bypass. Yeah, she sent the message. Then she looked up. How do you carry all of that in your head? The same way you carry balance sheets and acquisition timelines in yours, he said. No, just what my head does with information. She was quiet for a moment. I want to ask you one more thing, and you don't have to answer it. He waited. The badge, she said, on the conference table. Did you plan that? He thought about it. About the elevator ride down. About standing in the break room with his notebook and the maintenance log. About the specific sensation of reaching up and unclipping it. He said, it was the right thing to do. I know. I mean, it was the right message. For you, even though it made everything worse in the short term. Sometimes the right message is also the expensive one, he said. She nodded slowly, looking at her mug. My father used to say something like that. He'd say the truth has a cost, and so does silence, and you should pick your cost carefully. Sounds like a smart man. He was, she looked up. He also had a habit of judging people by their credentials and their connections, and not much else. I thought I'd outgrown that. A pause. Apparently not as much as I thought. Caleb finished his coffee. He set the mug down and looked at Audrey Langston across the small table, and he thought about what Renata had said. One of those is a crime. The other is ignorance, and he thought about the difference between someone who does harm knowingly and someone who does harm they've never been made to look carefully at what they're doing. Both caused damage. That was real, but they weren't the same thing. Stood up. Monday, she said. He left the coffee shop and walked to his truck and sat in the parking lot and thought about the weekend he'd said he needed and what he actually needed it for. Not rest, there wasn't going to be much of that. He needed to go through Nora's documents again, more carefully, with the specific intention of organizing them into something that could withstand legal scrutiny. He needed to make some calls. He needed to figure out exactly what he was walking back into and where the fractures were, not in the machinery this time, but in the institution. He also needed to take Lily to the park, because he'd promised her Saturday, and he kept his promises to his daughter, even when everything else was in motion. He started the truck and pulled out into Friday morning traffic, and his phone rang almost immediately. Davies, you're coming back, Davies said, before Caleb could speak. It wasn't a question. How do you know that? Because engineering just got a very specific instruction from the CEO's office about Junction 11 and the tertiary bypass, and that is not a phrase that Audrey Langston came up with on her own. A pause. No. Monday. We need you before Monday. Tell your engineering team to follow the instruction exactly, and it'll hold until Monday. I'll be there at set 7. Caleb. Davies' voice had a different quality, now lower, something with more weight in it. What you did. Putting the badge down. There are people on that floor who have been talking about nothing else for 4 days. What are they saying? That someone finally said it out loud. A pause. You didn't just quit. That's how they saw it. You said something that needed to be said. Caleb drove and didn't answer for a moment. Tell them I'll see them Monday, he said. Saturday he took Lily to the park as promised. She wanted to go to the one with the creek, which was a 20-minute drive and required waterproof boots, because Lily's version of visiting a creek involved actually getting into it and examining things. He packed a bag with extra socks, a thermos of hot chocolate, and the field guide to insects she'd gotten for her birthday, because the creek visit had evolved over several trips into an informal research expedition that was clearly feeding the Moth and Butterfly Science Fair project. in ways Caleb hadn't fully anticipated. They spent 2 hours there. Lillian found on 3 different larvae cases under rocks, which she photographed with Caleb's phone and recorded in the small notebook she'd started keeping, a habit that made Caleb feel something complicated and warm when he noticed it. She also fell in the creek up to her knee, which was inevitable, and stood there looking at her soaking boot with the expression of someone assessing a situation rather than upset about it. She said, "Yeah," Caleb agreed, already opening the bag for the extra socks. "Cold, I know, but I found the larva case right before. So," she shrugged with the pragmatism of a child who has decided the trade was worth it. They sat on a dry rock, and he helped her change her sock and boot, and she poured hot chocolate from the thermos and handed him a cup without being asked. And they sat there for a while, with the sound of the creek and the cold air and the November trees standing bare against a gray sky. "Are you nervous?" Lily asked. He looked at her. "About what?" "Going back. To the place that was mean to you." He thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest, without being more than a 7-year-old needed to carry. "A little," he said. "But I know what I'm doing there." "That helps. Is the mean lady still going to be there?" "Langston." "Yeah. She's the CEO. Did she say sorry?" Lily considered this. Was it a real sorry or a because I have to sorry? Caleb looked at his daughter. "You know the difference?" "Yeah, when Tyler Marsh stepped on Priya's lunchbox, he said sorry, but he didn't look at her when he said it." "Because I have too. Ms. Langston looked at me when she said it," Caleb said. "Hey." Lily accepted this as sufficient information. She drank her hot chocolate. "Are you going to make sure the bad man gets in trouble?" She meant Preston. She didn't know his name. Caleb had given her a simplified version of the situation, stripped of specifics, mostly to explain why things at home were unsettled. "That's being taken care of," he said, "by people whose job it is to take care of it. But you're making sure." "I'm making sure." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to the field guide, turning pages until she found the section on moth larvae. She was already constructing the comparative analysis in her head. Caleb could tell the same slightly inward look that meant her brain was working on something independent of whatever was happening around her. He sat beside her on the rock and looked at the creek and thought about Monday. He arrived at Northstar at 6:52 a.m., which was 8 minutes before he'd told Davies, because he wanted to walk the facility before anyone expected him. He came through the front entrance, not the service entrance he'd used for 11 years, and the security guard at the front desk, a man named Garrett, who'd been there almost as long as Caleb, looked up from his monitor and stopped. Garrett said, "Morning." Garrett looked at him. Clean blue shirt, the slacks instead of the maintenance uniform. The visitor badge that Davies had arranged, which felt deeply strange to be wearing in a building where Caleb knew the location of every junction box and pressure valve. "Good to have you back," Garrett said, and then in a lower voice, "Seriously." "Thanks." Garrett walked through the lobby, which looked the same as it always had, and went to the elevator, the main elevator, the service one, and went down to the maintenance level first, because that was where he needed to start. The maintenance floor at that hour was quiet, with the particular quality of a space that's operational, but not yet fully awake. The overhead lights were on half power. Equipment hummed at idle. 2 technicians on early shift were at the far end, and when they saw Caleb come around the corner, one of them, a young guy named Deeks who'd been there 3 years, stopped walking entirely. Deeks started. "Morning," Caleb said. The other technician, an older woman named Patel who rarely showed visible emotion about anything, gave him a look that managed to communicate significant respect in under 2 seconds. "Time," she said. "Walk me through what's happened since Tuesday," Caleb said. "Everything." They walked the floor for 90 minutes. Caleb listened and looked, and occasionally crouched down to check something himself, and what he found was worse in some places, and better in others than he'd anticipated, based on Hatch's reports. Line 4 was down completely, which he'd expected. The Eastern Assembly Corridor had a vibration issue that Patel had correctly identified as a bearing problem and partially compensated for. Line 7 was holding on the tertiary bypass exactly as he'd directed, but holding the way something holds when it's at the edge of what it can do. Luis Mendoza arrived at 7:30. Caleb heard him before he saw him the particular combination of work boot sounds, and the habit Luis had of whistling something low and tuneless when he was thinking. He came around the corner, into the main maintenance corridor and stopped when he saw Caleb. Luis Mendoza was 51 years old, built like someone who had been doing physical work his entire adult life, with gray coming in at his temples and hands that showed every year of their history. He'd been at Northstar since Caleb was still in school. He knew this facility the way Caleb knew it, not from documentation, but from 10,000 hours of direct contact with its machinery. They looked at each other. "You're back," Luis said. Caleb said. Luis nodded slowly, the nod of a man choosing his words. "They tell you about the eastern bearing?" Patel told me. "I want to look at it myself." "Yeah," Luis fell into step beside him. "It's worse than she thinks. I told them Thursday they want a second opinion." A pause. "Everything here always needs a second opinion." "That's changing," Caleb said. Luis glanced at him. Something, the sideways glance, not quite hope, but adjacent to it, the expression of someone who's heard sentences like that before, and knows better than to fully trust them, and can't quite stop themselves from wanting to. "Told me about the team lead position," Luis said quietly. "It should have happened 4 years ago. Try 3 times ago." Luis said it without bitterness, which was somehow more affecting than bitterness would have been. Just a fact he'd been carrying a long time. "You had something to do with that?" "I told them it needed to happen. The decision was theirs. But you told them?" "Yeah." Luis was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay, let's go look at the bearing." By noon, Caleb had a clear picture of the facility's current state, and it was not a comfortable picture. He sat in the small meeting room that Davies had arranged for him, not an executive office. Not yet. Just a room with a table and a whiteboard, and he wrote the situation out on the board, in his handwriting that was tight and functional, and covered the whiteboard in 20 minutes. 7 systems needed attention. 3 were urgent. Line 4 was the most complex and would require the longest repair sequence. The eastern bearing was second priority. That one was actually more immediately dangerous than the Line 4 situation, because it was still running and running wrong. The Line 7 bypass was a patch, not a fix, and the patch had maybe a week before it started failing. He was still writing when there was a knock at the door. "Come in," he said, not turning around. The door opened. He heard the sound of footsteps that weren't Davies's or Hatch's or anyone else from maintenance. He turned. Audrey Langston was standing in the doorway. She looked at the whiteboard, at the columns of system identifications and failure modes and timelines that covered every available inch of it, and her expression did something complicated that resolved after. A moment into something that was close to stricken. "That's all current?" she asked, "as of this morning." She stepped into the room. "The eastern bearing needs to be shut down for replacement today. This afternoon if possible. Tonight at absolute latest. That takes the eastern assembly offline for approximately 8 hours. The alternative is it fails while running, which takes it offline for significantly longer and carries a safety risk that I'm not comfortable with." She looked at the board, then at him. "How long has it been at this state?" "The bearing 6 weeks. He paused. "It was flagged in a maintenance report 4 weeks ago." The report was in the queue for engineering review. Her jaw tightened. Whose queue? Shaw's. The name landed in the room the way it had been landing in rooms all week, with a specific, complicated weight. She said nothing for a moment. "I need to tell you something," she said. "And I'm telling you because you're operating in this facility and you have a right to know the full situation." She came further into the room, stopped near the table. "Shaw was suspended on Friday. His attorneys have made initial contact regarding the patent dispute. They're characterizing it as documentation oversight. Our outside counsel is characterizing it differently." "What it is," Caleb said. "Yes, the board knows too." She looked at the whiteboard. "The independent review firm starts tomorrow. They'll need access to your documentation." Whitfield has copies of everything. She's the one who organized it. Spoken with her. A pause. She's also been offered a position if she wants to come back. Caleb raised an eyebrow slightly. That was your decision? The right call. Audrey looked at him steadily. I'm trying to make the right calls. That's going to be a process, he said. A moment. I understand that. He turned back to the whiteboard. Let's start with the eastern bearing. I need authorization to pull the eastern assembly offline this afternoon, and I need 3 additional technicians. Have it. I also need direct communication authority. If I make a call on a system shutdown, I don't want it bouncing through 3 management layers before it gets executed. Failing situation, every hour matters. She was quiet for a moment. That's a significant operational authority for someone in a consulting role. It is. He looked at her. That's why I'm asking. Another moment. You'll have it. I'll put it in writing before end of day. Turned back to the board. Then I need to get Louise and start on the bearing. She didn't move immediately. He could feel her still in the room, standing at the edge of the and he thought she was going to say something else. She did. For what it's worth, she said. What you wrote on this board, most of my engineering team couldn't have produced this in a week. You did it in 4 hours. He didn't turn around. I've known this building for 11 years. Pause. I'm saying I see it now. He kept his eyes on the board. Columns of systems and timelines and failure modes, the building's hidden architecture, laid out in plain language, the knowledge he'd been carrying for over a decade. Okay, he said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even close to the full resolution of what had been done to him. Just the word that fit the moment, an acknowledgement that the statements for something, that the seeing of it counted for something, even if something was not the same as everything. She left. He stood at the whiteboard a moment longer, then picked up his marker and added a 7th item to the list, a pressure coupling in the sub-basement tunnel that he'd been tracking since the week before he quit, the one that'd been speaking to him in a language of sound and vibration that he'd never been able to fully explain to anyone who hadn't spent years learning to listen to it the same way. He wrote the notation, circled it, added a question mark, the way he always did when he was certain something was wrong but hadn't yet confirmed exactly what. Then he capped the marker and went to find Louise. The facility was in bad shape. There was real work to do, complicated and urgent, and in some places genuinely risky, and he knew it better than anyone else in the building. That was simply the truth of the situation, not a source of pride, just a fact about how 11 years of knowledge accumulates in a person. He pushed open the door to the maintenance corridor. Familiar smell of the place reached him, machine oil and old concrete, and the particular quality of air that moves through large industrial spaces. And he walked toward the Eastern Assembly, with Louise's tuneless whistle already audible from somewhere ahead. And he thought that the building sounded different when you were walking through it as yourself, instead of as the version of yourself that other people had decided to see. Louder, maybe, more real, or maybe that was just him paying closer attention than he used to let himself. He turned the corner, and Louise looked up from the bearing housing with a wrench in one hand, and an expression that said that clearly they were about to have their work cut out for them. And Caleb nodded, and they got to work. The eastern bearing took 11 hours. Not 8, the way Caleb had estimated. Estimates are made with the information available at the time, and the information available at the time had not included the discovery that the bearing housing itself had developed a hairline fracture along its inner race, which meant that replacing the bearing alone would have solved the immediate problem, and created a worse 3 weeks later, when the housing failed under load. Caleb found the fracture at 4:20 in the afternoon, 40 minutes into what's supposed to be a straightforward replacement, lying on his back under the assembly housing, with a flashlight between his teeth and his fingers, coats, tracing the metal surface the way a doctor traces a collarbone looking for something that shouldn't be there. He said a word that he would not have said in front of Lily. Crouching nearby, leaned in. What? Housing's cracked. Inner race. Caleb moved the flashlight. Here, feel it. Louise reached in and ran his thumb along the surface. His expression didn't change. Dramatically. Luis was not a man given to dramatic expressions, but his eyes did something that communicated the full weight of finding a fracture in a structural housing that had been running a production line for the past 6 weeks. How long has this been here? Luis asked. I don't know. Long enough. Caleb pulled himself out from under the assembly and sat up on the concrete floor. I need to call Davies. You need to call Langston. Direct authority. Use it. He looked at Luis. Luis was right. He picked up his radio. This is Rowan. Eastern Assembly is down. We've got a housing fracture on the bearing mount. I need a replacement housing unit, check parts inventory and storage bay. C. There should be a compatible unit from the 2019 procurement order. If it's not there, we're looking at an outside order and a longer timeline. Davies' voice came back. Copy that. On it, the housing was in storage bay C, as Caleb had calculated it would be, because he'd been the one who'd logged it there 3 years ago, specifically against the possibility of a situation like this one. That small fact, the evidence of his own past self thinking ahead, leaving himself a resource he would need years later, struck him as he signed off the radio, and he sat with it for a moment on the concrete floor of the Eastern Assembly corridor. He'd been taking care of this building even when no one was watching, even when no one would know. He got up and kept working. By the time the Eastern Assembly came back online at 11:15 that night, most of the day shift had gone home and been replaced by the skeleton night crew. Luis was still there. Deeks, Patel, and 2 other technicians from the floor who had stayed without being asked. When the system powered up and the pressure readings came in clean, genuinely clean, the false clean of a reading that was lying to you, Deeks made a sound that was somewhere between to cheer and a laugh, quickly suppressed. Yes, he did, and Patel looked at her tablet with the expression of someone deeply satisfied by a correct number. Luis caught Caleb's eye. Good, Luis said. Just that. Yeah, Caleb agreed. He drove home at 11:40, with grease on his hands and a deep tiredness in his shoulders that was the physical kind, the kind that comes from actual work, which he'd always found more manageable than the other kind. He showered, checked on Lily asleep, one arm thrown over the edge of the bed the way she always slept, her field notebook open on the nightstand, and went to bed. He was back at Northstar at 6:50 the next morning. The days that followed had a particular texture to them. Dense, layered, full of the specific pressure of multiple simultaneous problems that each required full attention while refusing to wait for the others to be resolved first. Line 4's repair was the largest undertaking. It required a full replacement of the coupling assembly, which meant sourcing specific components, coordinating a shutdown sequence that wouldn't cascade into the adjacent lines, and doing the actual installation work in a space that was not designed with ease of access in mind. Caleb spent parts of 3 days in positions that would have been unkind to a person in significantly better shape, in the maintenance tunnels under Line 4's primary housing, and he came home each of those nights with his body arguing with him in languages he hadn't heard since his early 30s. But the work was moving. That was the thing about difficult problems in physical systems. They yielded to the right application of knowledge and patience and time, in a way that human problems sometimes refuse to. A fracture either repaired or it didn't. A pressure reading was either accurate or it wasn't. There was a specificity to it that Caleb found genuinely sustaining, especially in a week where the human dimension of the situation kept introducing new complications. Complications had a name, and the name was Preston Shaw. Shaw's attorneys filed a formal response to the investigation on Wednesday, and the response was what Hatch described as aggressive. Characterization of 114 separate documented instances as administrative error was still on the table. Now it was supported by a lengthy technical argument about the collaborative nature of engineering work, about how solutions emerge from teams, about how credit attribution in industrial settings is inherently diffuse, about how a maintenance technician and a senior engineer reviewing the same problem might both legitimately claim contribution to a solution. It was the kind of argument that sounded plausible if you didn't know the specifics and looked carefully crafted to confuse anyone who might need to evaluate it without technical expertise. Caleb read the filing summary that Hatch sent him. He read it twice, carefully. Then he put it down and went back to line 4. Because he had work to do, and because reading Shaw's attorneys trying to reframe 11 years of systematic theft as a philosophical question about collaborative credit was something that required either action or distance, and distance wasn't available. He chose action. Nora Whitfield had returned to Northstar in a limited capacity, not officially back on staff yet, but working with the independent review firm as a document resource, because she was the person who understood the filing system best, and because the review firm had quickly discovered that trying to navigate 11 years of Northstar's internal documentation without her was significantly slower. Yoon T-Nand. She found Caleb in the maintenance room on Wednesday afternoon where he was reviewing component specs for the Line 4 coupling replacement. "You've seen the Shaw filing?" she said without preamble. "Some summary of it. They're saying the patent designs were developed in collaborative sessions and that Shaw's contribution as supervising engineer constitutes co-authorship under the company's IP policy." She sat down across from him and put a folder on the table. The problem is that the IP policy language is genuinely ambiguous. It was written in 2011 and nobody's updated it. What does the review firm say? That the policy language isn't the main issue. The main issue is the documentation. If we can show a clear chain from your original work to the patent filings in your handwriting, time-stamped, predating Shaw's involvement, the policy argument becomes secondary. She opened the folder. "I have 16 items that I think meet that standard clearly. I need to know if you have additional documentation that might support the others." He looked at the folder. "My personal logs. I've been keeping maintenance logs in my own notebook since I started here. They're at my house." Nora looked at him. "Those aren't company property. They're yours. I know. Caleb, if those logs document the development process for any of the patented innovations, they could be the strongest evidence in the review." He said again, "I'll bring them in." "All of them?" He thought about the notebooks. 17 of them, spanning 11 years, filling a shelf in his home office that he'd built himself from scrap wood, and which leaned slightly to the left because one of the brackets was a quarter-inch off. He thought about the tight handwriting, the pressure readings, the questions marks, beside things he was tracking, the calculations done in margins to himself that were never meant for anyone else's eyes. "All of them," he said. He brought them in Thursday morning in a cardboard box, and Nora took possession of them with the careful handling of someone who understood what they were looking at. Yes, review firm spent 2 days going through them with a technical consultant who had been specifically brought in to evaluate the engineering content. Caleb didn't hover. He had line 4 to think about. Line 4 came back online on Friday at 2:30 p.m. He was standing in the maintenance tunnel when the pressure readings stabilized, holding his hand against the coupling housing the way he'd held it that first morning, listening through his fingertips. The vibration pattern was different now. Clean. Even. The sound that wasn't quite a sound had resolved into something quieter, which in machinery meant something was right that had been wrong for a long time. He stood there for a moment by himself in the tunnel. He thought about the 11 years of mornings that had started this way. In this tunnel, in this specific quality of underground quiet, checking systems that nobody else was checking in the ways he'd checked them. He thought about all the problems he'd caught before they became disasters, all the solutions he'd worked out in his head while driving to school pickup, all the times he'd come in early or stayed late or skipped a lunch break because something was running slightly wrong and he needed to know why. Thought about Jonna, who had never seen him do this work but had known, somehow, that the work mattered to him in a way that went beyond the paycheck. Yes, he'd intervened, and who had told him once that the way he talked about machinery was the way other people talked about art. He thought about Lily's notebook, filling up with moth larvae observations. He took one more breath in the quiet of the tunnel. Then he keyed his radio. Line 4 is back. Start your pressure verification sequence. Climbed out of the tunnel into the regular noise and light of the maintenance floor, and Luis was standing there with a cup of coffee, actual good coffee, not the break room kind, which he held out to Caleb without a word. Caleb took it. They stood there a minute, drinking coffee, which was enough. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Hatch had called it an emergency session, which was technically accurate given the ongoing contract situation with Callaway, but which Caleb understood also meant something else. It was the meeting where the investigation's preliminary findings would be presented, where Shaw's attorneys would make their opening arguments, and where the board would have to decide what to do with a situation that had gotten considerably more complex than anyone had anticipated when Caleb walked out of the building 11 days ago. Spent Monday night at the kitchen table with Lily, helping with a homework assignment about ecosystems, while simultaneously reviewing the summary documents the review firm had sent him. It was the kind of parallel processing his brain did automatically, one track handling Lily's questions about food chains, the track reading the review firm's preliminary conclusion that 11 of the 16 clearly documented items constitute unambiguous intellectual property attribution failure, with 12 additional items requiring further analysis. 23 items alone in the preliminary review, with more likely to follow. He read that number, and he felt something that wasn't satisfaction, and wasn't anger, and wasn't grief exactly, though it had elements of all three. It was more like the feeling of having a suspicion confirmed that you'd always hoped was wrong. "Dad," Lily said. "Yeah. Is a decomposer the same as a scavenger?" Decomposer breaks down dead material at the cellular level, bacteria, fungi. Scavenger eats dead material that's already there. Different function in the ecosystem. Lily wrote this down with the focused gravity to write information she considered important. So they both need the thing to be dead first. Right. One of them makes it disappear, and one of them just eats it. Basically, she looked at what she'd written. Decomposers seem more important. They're both important. Ecosystems need everything to do its specific job. She nodded slowly, the nod that meant she was filing the information. Then she looked at his documents. "Is that about the stolen stuff? Is it bad?" He thought about how to answer. "It's a lot. More than I realized. Are you mad?" He looked his daughter across the kitchen table at the serious face and the careful eyes, and he thought about what honesty required in this specific situation. "I was," he said. "I'm getting to the place past mad, where you just want it dealt with." She seemed to accept this. "Priya says the best revenge is being successful and also making sure they know it." Caleb blinked. "Priya said that?" Her older sister told her. "She's in high school." A pause. "I think it means you should win, but not be mean about it." Pretty good interpretation. "Are you going to win?" He looked at the documents, at the 23 items, the 12 more under analysis, at the notebooks that were currently being reviewed by a technical consultant who had told the review firm, in a preliminary note that Hatch had passed along to Caleb, that the engineering work documented in those notebooks was, in his professional assessment, the work of an unusually sophisticated technical mind. Caleb said, "I think so." The board meeting was held in the main conference room, the same room from which Caleb had been removed 11 days earlier. He registered this fact when he walked in, not dramatically, just as a piece of information that the room seemed to contain alongside its usual furniture. The configuration was different from the Callaway meeting. The long table had the same people on one side, board members, Hatch at the head, Audrey to one side, but the other chairs held the independent review firm's lead investigator, a woman named Dr. Sandra Okafor, who had the demeanor of someone entirely unintimidated by expensive suits, and the company's outside legal counsel, and two representatives from Shaw's legal team who radiated the specific energy of people preparing to defend a position they privately found difficult. Caleb sat at the table, not along the wall, not at the periphery. He sat at the table, in a chair that had been placed there specifically for him, which Hatch had arranged, and which felt, in a way that was difficult to articulate, like a more significant act than anything that had been said in the coffee shop or at Hazel's. He had his laptop. He had his notebook, the current one, not the archived ones. He had a folder with 3 documents he'd prepared himself, in his own words, organized the way he organized maintenance reports, clear, sequential, without unnecessary language. Shaw's attorneys spoke first. Their opening was polished and had clearly been prepared with significant effort. The word collaborative appeared 17 times. The phrase established industry practice appeared 9 times. There was a lengthy section about the inherent difficulty of attribution in team engineering environments, which Dr. Okafor listened to with a stillness that Caleb found quietly impressive. When they finished, there was a moment of silence. She looked at Caleb, Mr. Rowan. Caleb opened his laptop. "I have documentation of 114 separate instances," he said, "spanning 11 years. I want to be precise about what I mean by documentation, because the opposing argument has been that attribution in engineering work is inherently collaborative, and therefore difficult to assign clearly." He turned the laptop to face the board. "These are not difficult to assign clearly." He walked them through it methodically. Emotionally, that was not what this required. He spoke the way he diagnosed a failing system, with precision, with sequence, with the specific evidence that connected cause to effect. He showed them maintenance records in his handwriting, time-stamped, predating patent filings, by months in some cases. He showed them emails in which he had described technical solutions to colleagues that then appeared in Shaw's presentations, weeks later, credited solely to Shaw. He showed them system access logs that placed him specifically his employee ID, his terminal, his timestamps as the originating user on 7 of the design processes that Shaw had later filed as his own work. He showed them 3 instances where Shaw's own emails, produced in the document discovery, showed Shaw's describing a solution that he had been given by Caleb in a prior conversation, without attribution, presenting it upward as his own thinking. The boardroom got quieter as he went, not the polite quiet of people waiting for their turn. The specific quiet of people whose understanding of a situation is shifting in real time. Shaw's attorneys stopped taking notes about 40 minutes in, which Caleb noticed. When he finished, he closed the laptop and sat back and waited. Dr. Okafor spoke next. Her summary of the review firm's findings was careful and thorough, and, in its measured professional language, more damning than anything Caleb had said. She confirmed 11 instances of clear intellectual property attribution failure. She listed 12 more under active review that showed preliminary evidence consistent with the same pattern. Kent presented the technical consultant's assessment of the notebooks, the phrase unusually sophisticated technical work, clearly originating with the same author across the full 11-year period, and she noted that the pattern across all documented instances was not consistent with collaborative credit confusion. It was consistent with systematic appropriation. One of the board members, a woman in her late 50s who Caleb didn't know by name, said quietly, "What does that mean in plain language?" Dr. Okafor looked at her. "It means one person repeatedly took another person's work and put his name on it." For 11 years, the room was very still. Shaw's lead attorney cleared his throat. "We would argue that the documentation is counsel," Hatch said, and there was something in his voice that ended the sentence. He looked at Caleb, the financial valuation, the review firm's estimate. Dr. Okafor had it in front of her. Based on the confirmed instances and the company's revenue records for the relevant periods, the intellectual property involved generated an estimated $16.4 million in value for Northstar Aeronautics. $16.4 million. The number landed in the room and stayed there. Audrey, who had been silent for the entire presentation, was looking at the table. She had been looking at the table for about 30 minutes. Her jaw was set in a way that Caleb recognized as controlled emotion, not indifference, not calculation, but the specific expression of a person making a very strong effort to keep their reaction proportionate and professional. She looked up at Caleb, and what was in her face in that moment was not the expression she'd worn in the conference room 11 days ago. It was something more complicated than that, and more honest. I owe you an apology that is considerably larger than the one I gave you in the coffee shop, she said. The room waited. I came into this company 3 weeks ago, she continued, and within 72 hours I had made a decision in a meeting room that I based entirely on how a person was dressed. That decision was wrong, but this, she gestured, a small controlled gesture, toward the laptop, toward Dr. Okafor's documents, toward the 11 years of evidence laid out on the table. This is what was underneath that moment. And I didn't see it. The board didn't see it. This company didn't see it. A pause. That ends today. Shaw's lead attorney started to speak. I would like to discuss, Hatch said to them, with a precision that was almost gentle, the terms under which your client's employment is being concluded and the process by which these patent records will be corrected. I'd suggest we treat that as a separate conversation with counsel. But the board's position on the underlying facts is not something we need to continue debating. A beat. Are we clear? Hatch said. Shaw's attorneys exchanged a look. Lead attorney gathered his papers. We'll need to consult with our client. Course. My office can schedule a time. Hatch's voice was entirely civil. Thank you for your time this morning. They left. The room changed when they did a slight release of pressure, the way a room changes after a window is opened. Hatch looked at the remaining board members. Several of them had the expressions of people who'd understood something in the last 90 minutes that they were still processing. One of the men near the end of the table, older, been on the board longer than most, from what Caleb understood, said, What's the legal exposure on the patent corrections? Manageable, Hatch said. Our counsel believes the corrections can be processed administratively for most of them. The financial settlement with Mr. Rowan is a separate matter. What's the number? The board member asked. Hatch looked at Caleb. This had been part of their pre-meeting conversation, and Caleb had given Hatch a position to present. Mr. Rowan's position is straightforward, Hatch said. He's not seeking maximum damages. He's seeking compensation proportional to what was taken from him. Outside counsel's preliminary assessment puts a reasonable settlement in the range of what I think everyone in this room can agree is significantly less than what a full litigation would cost the company in time, in legal fees and in reputational terms. A pause. Mr. Rowan is also not interested in a prolonged fight. He's interested in resolution. The board member nodded slowly. And in return, Hatch looked at Caleb again. Caleb said, in return, I want the patent records corrected, which is not optional regardless. I want the financial settlement we've discussed. And I want the changes I've already made as conditions of my return to be formalized, the floor worker recognitions, the Luis Mendoza promotion, the contribution documentation system that I'm proposing. He paused. Those are concessions I'm making to get the settlement. They're things that need to happen for this company to be what it's supposed to be. I'm asking for them separately because they're separate. The board member looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Hatch. I think we can work with this, he said. The other board members appeared to agree in the particular way that boards agree through a series of small nods and non-objections that collectively constitute a position. Audrey was looking at Caleb, the director of engineering operations position, she said. I want to make that offer formally, today, in this room. It was coming. Hatch had indicated it the day before. He'd thought about it for 24 hours, which was approximately 22 hours longer than most people would have expected him to need. He'd spent those hours not thinking about the title, or the office, or the executive authority. He'd spent them thinking about what the position would actually allow him to do specifically, about the contribution documentation system he'd been building in his head since he'd sat at Nora Whitfield's kitchen table on the first day and listened to her say she'd been watching him fix the building for 6 years. I'll accept, he said, with the conditions on record. All of them, Audrey said, on record. Then yes. She nodded once. Yes, he didn't fiend. And there was something in the nod that had nothing to do with business, something that looked like a person arriving. after a difficult journey at a place where they could finally stand upright. Hatch called a brief recess, and people stood and moved around the room, and Caleb sat for a moment at the table and looked at his laptop and his notebook and his folder of documents. And he thought about the morning of the Callaway meeting, when he'd been in the maintenance tunnel before 6 a.m., reading a pressure gauge that was lying to him. He thought about how many mornings had started exactly that way. Thought about $16.4 million worth of work done in the gaps between shifts and in the tunnels below the building and in the margins of other people's projects, because the work needed doing and because he was the person who understood how to do it. But he had ever thought to ask why that was. It had taken him walking out of the room and the building coming apart in his absence for anyone to think to ask that question. He closed his laptop. Luis was not in the board meeting. He was on the maintenance floor, running the morning crew through a verification sequence on Line 7's bypass repair. Because the bypass was coming out today and the permanent fix was going in, required full attention and a specific sequence and the kind of steady technical presence that Luis brought to every job. Caleb thought about that, and he thought about Lily asking if they were going to be okay. And he thought about what it would mean to deposit a settlement check that represented 11 years of work finally acknowledged in the only language that institutions reliably understand. The money would secure Lily's future. That was real, and it mattered, and he let himself feel it mattering, without apology. But he sat at that table in the conference room, where he'd once been asked to leave, with his name now effectively on the door. And what he felt most clearly was not triumph and not relief, and not even the satisfaction of a thing finally corrected. What he felt was the readiness of a person who knows what needs doing next. Picked up his notebook, uncapped his pen, and started writing the outline of the contribution documentation system. Because the board meeting would reconvene in 15 minutes, and he had a proposal to make, and the proposal was not going to explain itself. The work still needed doing. It always had. The proposal took him 40 minutes to write by hand and another 20 to transfer into a format the board could actually read, which he did on his laptop in the corner of the conference room during the recess, while they made phone calls and refilled their coffee and had the kinds of hallway conversations that happen when a meeting has shifted the ground under everyone's feet. Called it simply, The Work Matters, a contribution documentation standard for Northstar Aeronautics. It was 11 pages, not long by the standards of corporate proposals, but specific in the way that only someone who had watched the problem from the inside for 11 years could be specific. Every repair logged under the originating technician's name. Every process improvement documented with a clear chain from concept to implementation. Every innovation, regardless of where it came from in the organizational hierarchy, recorded permanently in the company's official archive under the name of the person who created it. A quarterly review process in which floor workers and technicians could submit undocumented contributions for retroactive recognition. An independent technical committee, not management, not executives, empowered to evaluate disputes about attribution. The last section was the one he'd spent the most time on. It was a single page, and it said plainly that the system existed not because intellectual property law required it, did, not because it would reduce legal exposure for the company. It would, because work done by human beings deserves to carry their name. Because institutions that allow credit to flow only upward will eventually hollow out the people at the bottom who are doing the actual work. And a hollowed-out workforce is a liability that doesn't show on any balance sheet until it shows all at once in the form of failing production lines and suspended contracts and a maintenance technician who has run out of reasons to keep quiet. He wasn't sure that last paragraph was the kind of language that belonged in a corporate proposal. He left it in anyway. When the board reconvened, he presented the outline in 12 minutes, which was enough time to cover the essential structure without losing the room. Dr. Okafor asked 3 questions, all of them sharp, all of them good. 2 board members asked about implementation cost. She asked about the timeline. Audrey asked nothing. She read the document while he was talking, and he could tell by the way her eyes moved, she reading it carefully. Skimming. When he finished, the board member who'd asked about legal exposure. Earlier, the older man at the end of the table, whose name Caleb had learned during the recess, was William Carver, 22 years on the board. Formerly an engineer himself before moving into the investment side, said, "This is a good document." "Thank you," Caleb said. "I mean it as more than a compliment. The kind of document that could only be written by someone who has watched the problem at close range for a long time." Carver looked at him steadily. "I'm sorry we needed to lose you for a week before anyone thought to ask what you'd seen." The room was quiet. Caleb said, "The system doesn't fix what already happened. It changes what happens going forward." "Yes," Carver said. "That's the point." The board voted to adopt the framework as a formal working document, subject to a 60-day development period, during which Caleb would work with HR and legal, and Audrey's specific edition representatives from the floor crew itself to build out the full implementation. The vote was unanimous, which meant it included every person at the table, including two board members who had visibly spent the first half of the meeting in the posture of people who were not certain they wanted to be there. After the vote, Caleb sat for a moment and looked at the 11-page document in front of him, the one he'd written in 40 minutes in the corner of a conference room where 11 days ago he'd been asked to leave. He thought about what it meant that this was the version of the day that had happened. He was aware that it could have gone differently. If Hatch hadn't called, Nora hadn't come to his door with that bag, if Renata hadn't said the thing about a crime and ignorance being different problems, requiring different responses, if Luis hadn't handed him coffee without a word after the Eastern Assembly came back online, if Lily hadn't said, at a kitchen table over homework, that the best revenge was winning without being mean about it. None of it had been inevitable. That was the thing about the path from the tunnel to this chair. It had looked inevitable in retrospect, and it hadn't been. Not at all, not for a single step. He gathered his documents and closed his laptop and stood up, because there was still work to do today, and the board meeting, whatever it had accomplished, did not fix the pressure coupling in the sub-basement tunnel that he'd circled in his notebook 3 weeks ago and still not fully diagnosed. Callaway Defense Systems sent a formal communication the following Thursday. Caleb was in the sub-basement when Davies called him up. Climbed out of the tunnel, for the second time, in a month with grease on his hands, and a specific answer to the coupling question that he'd finally confirmed. That morning, it was a material fatigue issue, slower moving than the Line 4 problem. Soviet seeds intervened, but the same underlying cause, which told him something important about the procurement records from 2019 and 2020 that he was going to need to flag separately. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and read the communication on Davies's tablet. Callaway was resuming contract negotiations. The communications cited Northstar's demonstrated technical correction of the identified defects, confirmed by Callaway's own engineering team during a facility review conducted the previous week, and noted specifically that the company had demonstrated the capacity for honest self-assessment that Callaway required from long-term manufacturing partners. That phrase, honest self-assessment, landed somewhere in Caleb's chest in a way that surprised him slightly. It was bureaucratic language, the kind of phrase that lives in corporate communications and means something more mechanical than it sounds. But he read it and thought about the board meeting, and the document spread across his kitchen table the week before. No, and Audrey's face when Dr. O'Coffer had said one person repeatedly took another person's work and put his name on it. He thought honest self-assessments was probably underselling what had actually happened, but he understood that Callaway didn't have the full interior view of it, and that was fine. Contract negotiation resumed. The $43 million was back on the table. He handed the tablet back to Davies and went downstairs to write up the coupling findings. Sint. Preston Shaw's departure from the company was finalized on a Friday morning 2 weeks after the board meeting, which Caleb learned about from Hatch via a brief email that said the separation agreement had been signed and the patent correction process was beginning immediately. The email was 3 sentences. Caleb read it. replied with a single word acknowledged, and went back to the implementation plan for the contribution documentation system, which he was currently reviewing with a HR representative named Soo-Jin Park, who had turned out to be both genuinely capable and unusually direct, which Caleb appreciated. He did not feel triumphant about Preston Shaw's departure. He'd been waiting to feel something like that, expecting it the way you expect a physical sensation you've been anticipating, and it didn't come. What came instead was something quieter, not closure exactly, because the patent corrections would take months, and the full financial settlement was still being finalized, and some things, once done, leave a residue that doesn't fully resolve. Something like the release of a pressure that had been present so long he'd stopped registering it as pressure and had just incorporated it into his baseline understanding of what daily life felt like. Soo-Jin, who had been watching him, read the email from across the table, said, "Yue," he said, and he meant it. "Do you want to take a minute? I want to finish the section on retroactive recognition submissions," he said. "Quarterly review calendar isn't going to build itself." She looked at him for a moment. Then she pulled the document back toward her and picked up her pen. "Okay, where were we?" The settlement agreement was signed on a Wednesday afternoon in a conference room at the UFA's offices of Northstar's outside legal counsel, which was not the Northstar Aeronautics, and for which Caleb was mildly grateful. The room was neutral in a way that conference rooms at outside counsel always were. No company identity, no history embedded in the walls. Just a table and chairs and documents, and the particular atmosphere of something significant being concluded. Which was there. Audrey was there. Caleb's attorney, a woman named Delgado, who specialized in IP law, and had spent the first meeting with Caleb saying very little and reading his documents with the concentrated attention of someone doing a precise calculation, sat beside him and reviewed each page with an efficiency that Caleb found quietly reassuring. The number in the settlement was not 16.4 million. It was less than that, because Caleb had said he wasn't looking for maximum damages, and he'd meant it, and because Delgado had advised him that a number he could accept quickly and move forward from was worth more, practically speaking, than a number that required 2 more years of litigation to confirm. Was still significant enough that when Caleb saw it typed out on the first page of the agreement, he had a moment of pure, uncomplicated stillness that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with Lily. He thought about the college fund he'd been adding small amounts to since she was born. He thought about the modest house with the leaning bookshelf and the backyard with the chalk butterfly ghost onto the kite. He thought about every time he'd done the math at the kitchen table and concluded that if nothing changed and nothing went wrong, they'd be okay. Probably, if he was careful. Then had to be probably anymore. He signed the document. Audrey, across the table, signed the company's portion. She looked at him when they were both done, and what was in her face in that moment was not the CEO expression, the controlled professional mask. It was just a person sitting across from another person. At the end of something that had cost both of them considerably, and had arrived at this point through a series of choices that neither of them had fully anticipated making. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Not about the settlement." After. "All right." The attorneys completed their portions of the process, and then gradually the room emptied out until it was just the two of them, and Hatch, who had the quality of a person who understands when he's background furniture and was content to be that. "I've been thinking about what you said in the coffee shop," Audrey said. "About the work itself, about how what your head does with information is just what it does." She paused. "I want to understand how that stayed intact. 11 years of being credited to someone else, and you kept showing up and doing the work the same way. I don't understand that." Caleb thought about how to answer. Thought about the maintenance tunnel at 5:15 a.m., and the pressure gauge that was lying, and the notebook with the question mark. He thought about the specific satisfaction of finding the housing fracture before it became a failure. He beamed. He thought about Luis handing him coffee after 11 hours, and Lily's field notebook filling up with moth-lopve observations, and the sound of a production line running clean after it had been running wrong. The work was real, he said. Whatever else was true about the situations, the credit going somewhere else, the patents, the way I was treated, the work itself was real. The system either ran correctly or it didn't, and I was the one who knew how to tell the difference and what to do about it. He paused. That knowledge belonged to me, even when nothing else did. Couldn't take that part. Audrey was quiet for a moment. Most people would have stopped caring. After a few years of that. Some days I came close, he said, honestly. There were mornings where I thought about calling in and spending the day at home with my daughter and letting whatever was going wrong stay wrong. He looked at his hands on the table. But I knew what was in those tunnels. I knew what would happen if nobody went down there. And I couldn't pretend I didn't know that. That's not a business principle, Audrey said. That's something else. It's just how I'm built, he said. Not virtue. It's just I can't unknow things I know. She nodded slowly. Then I've been visiting the production floors. He looked at her. Every morning this week, before my other meetings. She said it without expectation of praise, just as information. I don't understand most of what I'm seeing yet, but I'm learning. What are you learning? She thought about it, that the building sounds different depending on what's wrong with it. Rourke was explaining the relay system to me yesterday. He said you taught him to listen to the pitch of the motor instead of just reading the gauge. A pause. Machinery had pitch. Everything that moves has a sound, Caleb said. Once you start listening for it, you can't stop. Like knowing things, she said. Like that. There was a moment between them that wasn't uncomfortable, just two people, sitting in the specific quiet of a thing that had been difficult, and was now, if not resolved, at least honestly inhabited. Caleb thought that whatever Audrey Langston would become as the leader of this company, she had at minimum the capacity for the kind of attention that required looking directly at things you'd prefer not to see. It was not nothing. That was in his experience fairly rare. I should get back, he said. The coupling? She said it without miss a beat, which told him she'd been paying attention to the morning reports. Coupling, he confirmed, and the quarterly review calendar. Sujin's waiting, he stood. Hatch shook his hand, which had the quality of something that meant more than the gesture required. Audrey stood too, and she extended her hand, and they shook, and it was not the handshake of an employer and an employee. It was the handshake of two people who had been on opposite sides of a significant thing, and had ended up, through a series of difficult and imperfect choices, somewhere that was not quite the same as trust, but was somewhere in the territory adjacent to it. He walked out of the building into an afternoon that was cold and clear, the November sky a clean pale blue with no clouds, and he sat in his truck for a minute before starting it. He called Renata. She picked up on the first ring this time. It's done, he said, a pause. Then all settlement signed. Shaw's out. Patent corrections are in process. The documentation system has board approval. Wiss has his title. He stopped. Yeah, all of it. He heard her breath on the line. Not a dramatic sound. Renata was not a dramatic person. For all her directness, just the specific quality of breath that means a person who has been holding something can let it go. How do you feel? She asked. He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about most things. Tired, he said. Relieved. A little strange. Strange how? Like I've been carrying something for so long that putting it down doesn't feel like relief yet. It just feels different, like the weight is gone. But I still know exactly what it weighed. That's how it works, Renata said. It takes a while before different starts to feel good. Caleb, yeah, you should feel good. I know you won't let yourself, not right away. But you should. He looked out the windshield at the afternoon. A man was walking a dog across the parking lot. The dog investigating something in the grass with tremendous purpose, and the man waiting with the patient expression of someone who has learned to let certain things take the time they take. I'm going to pick up Lily early, he said. Good. Take her to the park. Come home for dinner. Perfect. You want to come over? I'll make the chicken soup. I'll be there at 6, Renata said. Don't do the garlic bread without me. He laughed a real laugh, the kind that comes up unexpectedly and is over before you've fully registered it. 6, he said. I'll save you the garlic bread. He started the truck and drove to Lily's school. She came out of the building at 2:35, backpack hanging off one shoulder, paint on her fingers, which had apparently become a permanent feature of her existence. She saw his truck, and her face did the thing it did when she was surprised and pleased in equal measure, a quick, bright expression, held for only a second before she composed it back into something more measured, which she'd inherited entirely from him and which he found both recognizable and faintly hilarious. Climbed in. You're early. I am. Did something happen? Something finished, he said. I thought we could go to the park. She processed this. The creek park? If you want. I should probably bring the notebook. I figured. She put her seatbelt on. Then she looked at him with the careful attention she brought to things she was assessing seriously. Is it the good kind of finished? He thought about the settlement document. Hatch's handshake and Renata's voice, and Luis running his first morning crew as official team lead. About the contribution documentation system in its 60-day development period, and 11 names on a reclassification list, and patent records being corrected one by one in some legal office he'd never visit. About a pressure coupling in the sub-basement that still needed to be fully resolved, and a procurement record anomaly he'd flagged that morning. $18.4 million worth of work, finally called by its right name. About Lily's college fund, which was no longer a question of whether. He said, the good kind. She nodded, satisfied. She pulled her field notebook out of her backpack and opened it to a new page. Then she looked up. Priya's sister says when something big finishes, you should do something small to celebrate. Like ice cream or something ordinary. Your Aunt Renata's coming for dinner. Lily considered this. Can we have ice cream after dinner? We can have ice cream after dinner. Okay. She wrote something in her notebook. He couldn't see what. That's good, then, she said, and turned to look out the window at the November afternoon moving past, and they drove to the park. Creek. Lily did not fall in. This was unusual enough that Caleb noted it. She got close, she always got close. It was fundamental to her approach to the creek, but she maintained her footing on the rocks with an intent focus that suggested she'd decided today was not a falling-in day. She found 2 more larvae cases, both of which she photographed with his phone and documented in her notebook with the careful precision of someone who takes their scientific process seriously. She had opinions about both specimens relative to previous finds, which she delivered at length while Caleb sat on a dry rock and drank from the thermos and listened. He listened to all of it, not the way you listen when you're partly elsewhere, which he knew he'd been guilty of more than he wanted to admit in the past months, the kind of listening where your physical presence is complete, but your attention is running parallel calculations about hydraulic couplings or patent finds or what to say in a meeting that hasn't happened yet. He listened the way the day allowed him to listen, which was the way she deserved. She was, he thought, a remarkable person, not in the extraordinary gifted child way of parental bias, though he was certainly biased. The more specific way that she moved through the world with a directness and curiosity that didn't require an audience. She investigated things because she wanted to understand them. She made observations because they were true. She kept a notebook because the data mattered, not because anyone was going to grade it. He knew where she'd learned that. He also knew she'd gotten there on her own, which was the more important thing. Dad, she said, crouching over a rock she'd turned over. Come look at this one. He went and crouched beside her and looked. Whatever was under the rock had vacated recently, leaving only the remnant of a case, a delicate structure. Barely there, the ghost of an occupation. It's already gone, Lily said. Yeah, but you can see where it was. You can see where it was, he agreed. She photographed it anyway. For the record, she explained, without being asked to explain. He stayed crouched beside her for a moment, looking at the small empty case on the underside of the rock. And he thought about what it meant that things leave marks even when they've moved on. That presence can be documented. That absence can be read by someone who knows what they're looking at. Yeaned. He thought about 14 notebooks on a shelf that leaned slightly to the left. He thought about 114 instances now on record permanently. He thought about a contribution documentation system that would run at Northstar from now on, bearing no one's name on the outside because it belonged to everyone inside it. Recording work done by human hands under human names in a permanent archive that no one could quietly revise. He thought about all the buildings and all the industries and all the cities where the version of this story he'd lived was still being lived by other people, the Calebs, who hadn't yet found a Nora Whitfield at their door. The Lewises still waiting for the third time to not be enough. The people in maintenance tunnels and on production floors, doing the work that kept everything running, and going home to small houses and children who asked if they were going to be okay. He didn't know how to fix all of that. He was one person with a new title and a documented system and a settlement check that was still processing. He knew the limits of what one person can do, but he also knew that change moves from specific to general. That you fix the building you're standing in and you document the method, and you make it harder for the next person to be erased. The 11 pages he'd written in 40 minutes in a corner of a conference room were now a working document being developed by a team that included floor workers who had never sat in a meeting that decided anything. He knew that wasn't nothing. He knew it wasn't enough. He decided to do it anyway, which was the only option that sat right in his chest. Renata arrived at 6 with wine she'd chosen herself and strong opinions about the soup, which she expressed while tasting it from the pot with a spoon Caleb had not offered her. "More pepper," she said. "It doesn't need more pepper." "It does. I'm a disinterested expert. Your history teacher with a spoon." "Those are not mutually exclusive," she added pepper, while he watched with the expression of a man who has had this argument before and knows how it ends. She tasted it again. Better. It was fine before. It's better than fine. She set the spoon down and turned to look at him fully, the way she did when she was moving from sparring to something more direct. "You look different. I'm tired. Not that kind of different. The other kind." She studied him. "Like something's sitting differently on you." He thought about how to describe it. The thing about carrying weight for long enough is you forget it's there. And then when it's gone, you don't feel lighter. "You just feel different," she said. "Yeah, like yourself," she said. "That's what different means in this case. You just feel like yourself." He looked at his sister. She had the straightforwardness of someone who has always known exactly who she was and has never required external confirmation of it, which was something he'd admired about her for his entire life and had, he recognized, fully managed to replicate in himself until recently. "Yeah," he said, "something like that. Set the table with the focused competence she brought to domestic tasks she decided were her responsibility, which included table setting, juice pouring, and the distribution of napkins, which she handled with the authority of someone who has clear opinions about where napkins should be. She'd told Renata about the larvae cases in detail during the first 10 minutes after Renata arrived, and Renata had listened with genuine interest, which was one of her consistent qualities and one of the reasons Lily adored her. They ate dinner. The soup was good. It was always good. It had been Jana's recipe, and Caleb had learned to make it with the specific imprecision of someone working from memory and love rather than a written record, and it was never quite the same twice, which he thought Jana would have found appropriate. They talked about the moths and butterflies. They talked about Priya, whose decision-making authority over the science fair project had apparently expanded to include the poster design which Lily was negotiating carefully. Yes, he'd intervened. Renata talked about a student who had written an essay arguing that the most underrated thing in American Revolution was the people who had to clean up afterward, which she'd given an A. "Smart kid," Caleb said. "Infuriating kid," Renata said. "I mean that as a compliment." After dinner, ice cream. Lily had 2 scoops of chocolate and fell asleep on the couch 40 minutes later, with her field notebook open on her stomach, having clearly intended to do more documentation and been overtaken by events. Renata and Caleb sat at the kitchen table with the remainder of her wine and the quiet of the house around them. "She's going to be something," Renata said quietly, looking toward the living room. The moth thing, the comparative study. She's 8 years away from a college application, and I'm already thinking about what she's going to put in it. She's 7. I'm planning ahead. Renata looked at him. You should be proud, I am. I mean of you, not just her. You've been raising her alone for 4 years, and working in a place that was taking everything from you, and you kept showing up for both. She said it simply, not as a speech. Just as a fact she was placing on the table. That's not nothing. He didn't deflect it or minimize it the way he usually would have. He just sat with it for a moment. No, he said, it's not nothing. They sat in the quiet for a while longer. Outside, the November night was cold and clear. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog was barking at something, and then stopped. The next morning, Caleb arrived at Northstar at 6:55. Came through the front entrance, the clean blue shirt, slacks, the visitor badge that had been replaced with an executive badge that said C. Yes, he'd intervened, Rowan, director of engineering operations, which was new enough that he still had a moment of adjustment every time he looked at it, the slight cognitive gap between what he knew about himself and what the badge now said. He went to the maintenance floor first. He always went to the maintenance floor first, and he expected that he would continue to do this regardless of what the badge said or what floor his office was on. Because the floor was where the information was, and the information was where the work started. Luis was already there, running the morning briefing with the quiet authority of someone who had always been capable of it, and was now simply being allowed to demonstrate that openly. He saw Caleb come in and gave him the brief nod that meant, I've got this, nothing, urgent. And Caleb gave the nod back that meant, I know, quet, carry on. He walked the floor. He checked 3C systems that were in the tail end of their repair sequences. He stopped at the sub-basement access. And went down for 12 minutes to check after the adjustment he'd made 2 days prior. He wrote a note in his notebook. He came back up. He took the elevator to the executive floor. His office door had his name on it. He'd walked past it several times in the past 2 weeks, and each time it still produced that slight pause, not discomfort exactly, more like the sensation of something being true that had not been true before. The adjustment period between old reality and new one. He sat down, opened his laptop. The morning's first item was a meeting with Sue Jin and 2 floor worker representatives who were joining the documentation system development team, a woman named Carla from the assembly corridor, and a man named Tom who'd been on Line 4's crew for 8 years. The meeting was at 8. He had 45 minutes. He spent them working, not on the documentation system, not on the emails that had accumulated overnight, not on the Callaway contract update that was in his inbox flagged as a priority. So he'd intervened. He spent them on the pressure coupling anomaly in the sub-basement and the procurement records from 2019 and 2020 because there was something in those records that was still bothering him, a pattern that wasn't quite resolved. He wanted to understand it fully before it became something that needed to be fixed under pressure. He wanted to understand it because understanding it was what he did. Because the work was still there, the same as it had always been, regardless of what the badge said or what floor he was on, or whose name was now correctly attached to 11 years of solutions. The work didn't care about any of that. The work just needed doing, and he was the person who knew how. 7:58. He closed his notebook, picked up his coffee, and walked down the hall toward the conference room where Sue Jin and Carla and Tom were gathering. Carla was already there when he arrived, a woman in her mid-40s, with the practical efficiency of someone long accustomed to getting to places on time and prepared. Tom came in a minute later, slightly out of breath, carrying a folder and a coffee cup that was leaking slightly from the lid, which he addressed with a napkin and an expression of mild exasperation. Lid's been broken for 3 days, Tom said. Maintenance keeps saying they'll replace the cups. I'll get you a new cup, Caleb said. Tom looked at him. The badge. At the executive floor hallway visible through the open door. You don't have to. There's a supply cabinet at the end of the hall. I'll be right back. He was gone for 90 seconds and came back with a cup that didn't leak, which he handed to Tom, who accepted it with the slightly off-balance expression of a person recalibrating their expectations. Su-jin watched this without comment, but the corner of her mouth moved. "Okay," Caleb said, sitting down. "Let's talk about the quarterly review process. I want to hear from both of you about what's actually realistic for the floor crew to document in a given week, because I've been writing this system from memory, and memory has gaps." Carla opened her folder. Tom settled his new cup. Su-jin pulled up her laptop. They got to work. The morning moved forward, the way mornings do, not dramatically, not cinematically, just with the steady accumulation of things done and decisions made and problems partially resolved and other problems identified for the following day. Caleb sat at the table and listened and contributed and argued once, productively, yes, with Carla about the realistic weekly burden of documentation on line workers who were already running at capacity, conceded the point when she made it clearly enough and revised the proposal accordingly. He wasn't always right. He knew that. The system wasn't going to be perfect. He knew that too. It was going to be an imperfect system built by imperfect people addressing an imperfect history at a company that had not covered itself in glory and was now trying to do something better, and the gap between trying and succeeding was going to require constant attention and regular revision, and the willingness to hear when it wasn't working. He could do that. He'd been doing some version of that in the tunnels and on the floors for 11 years. The difference now was that the work would carry his name. The work of every person in that building would carry their name. And someday, not yet, not tomorrow, but eventually that would be the unremarkable standard rather than the exception. The thing no one thought to notice because it had always been true as far as anyone currently working there could remember. He intended to make it that ordinary. He intended to make it that permanent. After the meeting, he walked back to his office and stopped at the door, and he looked at his name on the door the way he'd looked at it every time before, with that same slight pause. He went inside and sat down and opened his laptop and got back to work, because the work was what mattered. It always had been, and that at least that one clear and fundamental thing had never needed anyone else to confirm it. He already knew. He'd always known. He just finally worked somewhere that knew it too.